I would like to start with the news that are just in. President Erdogan said that the Green Deal has just been extended for 60 days. It was preceded by long negotiations, we know, where Turkey had a very heavy mediator's hand in these negotiations. Does this add points to President Erdogan during the runoff?
Well, it certainly won't reduce any of his support, that's for sure, because I think in general, some of what drives Turkey's voters is a sense of pride and a desire to be appreciated in the world. And so extending the grain deal really strengthens Turkey's prestige, because it is such an important agreement. I mean, as we all know, had it not been extended, then there's a risk of famine in some parts of the world. So it may help him a little bit. But generally, the election is being, I think, driven by a sense, well, first of all, economic concerns, but a sense that either he or opposition leader Kılıçdaroğlu could do a better job in reestablishing economic stability, as well as rebuilding after the earthquake.
Matt, that was my next question. Does Turkish electorate in general care about international politics a lot, or now, and especially after the earthquakes, it's mainly the domestic agenda that is driving the decisions of the people in Turkey?
Yeah, generally, if you look at the body politic of the entire country, international relations don't play much of a role at all. It's they're worried about, as I said, maybe a general sense of Turkish prestige. But what drives them are internal domestic issues. But the earthquakes, by the way, I mean, they sort of helped Turkey soften its relations with Greece and with Armenia because of the assistance that both countries provided, and Israel as well. But there are elements of the electorate and Erdogan's own, electoral alliance, the far-right nationalist Action Party, or MHP, who do care a bit more about international relations, because they want Turkey to be really tough on the PKK and, in general, stake out Turkey's interests and its interpretation of international law when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, for example. So the tough rhetoric, the anti-Athens rhetoric, plays well with that part of the electorate. But again, overall, just like in the United States, foreign policy is a secondary issue.
This is very interesting, Matt. We heard assessments or analysis that for Erdogan, or actually the elections weren't the elections, but rather a referendum, a vote of confidence for Erdogan. Would you agree with that?
Very much. I very much agree with you, Yulia. I mean, he is the most dominant and skillful Turkish politician since Ataturk. And he's been in power for 20 years. And so, the election was definitely a referendum on him. And, he fared much better than the opposition expected. And in one area where it seemed like maybe he's going to suffer was the Turkish government's reaction to the February earthquakes. You'll recall that early on, there was a lot of complaining and criticism that the Turkish government reacted too slowly. And President Erdogan even recognized that. He said, the first 2 days we were too slow, but now, we're moving much faster and doing a better job. And to be fair, I guess, the area of devastation was so big. I mean, as big as the entire U.S. state of Ohio. I mean, and where the serious devastation occurred, there simply weren't not enough pieces of equipment or responders available to get to anywhere near even, a majority of the devastated buildings. But what has changed since then is not only has President Erdogan promised to rebuild 310,000 housing units, so apartments and homes, but like 110,000 of those are already under construction. So my sense is Turkish voters were surprised that the reconstruction has been going as quickly as it is. And the last thing I'll say on that is, if you look at the single hardest hit region, so that's the city of Antakya and Hatay province, traditionally those have been strong opposition bastions. And this time, however, the AKP did not win there, but they barely lost. They almost won. So if the hardest hit area almost flipped to support Erdogan and AKP, it would suggest that people think, okay, the government's doing a pretty good job on reconstruction.
Matt, Speaking about, or coming back to the international politics, I wanted to talk a little bit about the rhetoric of the opposition that concerned Russia and Ukraine, because there were a lot of statements made by the opposition leader. And it seems like it's gone through some evolution. Initially, the opposition leader said that he would support movement towards peace negotiations between Kyiv and Moscow, and that the relationship with Russia would not suffer as a result of the change of power in Turkey. But now the rhetoric seemed to be taking a slightly different course, and he just said, he just made a statement, Kılıç Daroglu just made a statement that he doesn't intend to lose in the runoff, first of all. And then he said, we will not leave our motherland to the leader who was the leader of the Middle East before, and now he is kind of getting closer to Russia, and he is knocking the door of Russia in a very humble position. I'm wondering, and I would like to ask you about the analysis of this change and about, in general, the mood and the rhetoric and the intentions towards the relationship with Russia, and the mood about the war in Ukraine, in Turkey, in these two opposition camps.
Sure. Well, I think the statements that you just cited by Kılıç Daroglu reflect difficulty for the CHP in figuring out what to do with regard to Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Because you could have added one more statement even, that the head of the foreign policy operation of CHP, extremely experienced and talented diplomat, Unal Çevikos, with whom I used to work really closely, he had said last week that if elected, the CHP government would impose or would join the sanctions against Russia. But then the next day, Kılıç Daroglu walked that back and said, well, no, we're not so sure what we're going to do. So I think there are structural reasons for why Erdogan and Turkey took this approach toward Russia. And therefore, those same structural reasons would lead to not much of a change in Turkish foreign policy were Kılıç Daroglu and the CHP to win. So what do I mean? First of all, of course, Turkey is a crucial member of NATO, with the alliance's second largest military, and had historically been seen as, in the old days during the Cold War, right, as the key to the southern flank of NATO in containing the Soviet Union. That policy changed a lot in recent years as business ties grew so dramatically between Ankara and Moscow. And so we see economic interdependencies. Turkey imports a lot of energy from Russia. Russia, however, is building the $20 billion nuclear power plant in Akuyu. That's good for, even though Russia is financing it. We all know how the atomic energy sector and so many other economic sectors work in Russia, and there are a lot of people benefiting from that big investment in Turkey. Turkey exports a large amount of agricultural goods to Russia, and also has exports in the form of tourists, Russian tourists who come to Turkey. So those economic ties are important for Ankara. On the other hand, number one, no NATO member state other than the Baltics and Poland have been as staunch in calling for NATO enlargement to include Ukraine and Georgia. The U.S. is much more careful. Germany doesn't really seem to want to see that enlargement happen. But Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu could not be more consistent in always supporting enlargement. Number two, President Erdogan could not have been more consistent in supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemning both of Russia's invasions in 2014 and then the annexation of Crimea, and then this latest one beginning in 2022. And consistently, Erdogan expresses support and demands the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity. On top of that, we all know that Ankara has been providing drones that have had a decisive impact on the battlefield and are responsible for the deaths of lots of Russian soldiers and sailors. And there's other significant military technological cooperation, such as building together, but in Turkish shipyards, stealth-capable naval frigates for the Ukrainian Navy. So what I'm trying to say is any Turkish leader is going to be driven by these two sets of interests, right? You've got the economic interdependence, and then you've also got the strong support for Ukraine. And then overall, the most important factor is that Turkey has fought more wars going back to the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire against Russia than against any other country. So, the Turks know that they don't want Russia to be able to dominate them, but B, they also want to avoid unnecessary tension and acrimony where possible. And I think they think all this, the killing, the death, the destruction of Ukrainian people is a tragedy. And the final point is Turkey then therefore wants to carve out a role for itself as being diplomatically and strategically relevant in a new way, in a way that's, yes, rooted in the West, but not entirely. The cliche is Turkey as a bridge between East and West. In the past, that meant being rooted overwhelmingly in the West. Now that's shifted a little, though, during these last 21 years of AKP rule. And I think now the government sees itself, and the country sees itself largely, how to put it, more rooted in the East.
Matt, to what you said about the statements that President Erdogan made about NATO's enlargement, Ukrainian territorial integrity, obviously those statements are not very much liked in Moscow. At the same time, we're hearing analysis that in Moscow, they would prefer to have Erdogan staying in power because in part of the relationship between Putin and Erdogan, despite the fact that this relationship is not necessarily always rosy and they don't necessarily see eye to eye, just as you described. What do you have to say to this?
Well, Erdogan's foreign policy is like Trump's, make Turkey great again. And the foreign policy is transactional in a typical sort of Middle Eastern way. We're not friends, we're business associates, including in diplomacy. So then it's not at all contradictory for Erdogan to maintain a decent relationship or even a good relationship with Putin. But again, it's all transactional. Think about which NATO member states' military has fought Russia on the battlefield in recent decades. Only one, Turkey, both in Idlib province in northwest Syria and in Libya. So Erdogan, again, transactionally looks for common interests and pursues them if that's to Turkey's advantage, but simply will not be pushed around or intimidated by Putin or anybody else. And so I think that's what's playing out now in Turkish foreign policy toward Russia.
Would you agree that Moscow has a strong preference towards Erdogan despite everything?
Yeah, of course. Yes, sorry. It's not so much a case of the devil you know, but it's that there are important forms of cooperation that also benefit Russia, like the grain deal. Putin wouldn't have done it if it didn't benefit Russia in his mind. And I think Putin, there are two more factors. One, he is grateful, I think, and respects Erdogan as a tough guy who doesn't humiliate Putin publicly. Erdogan takes a tough stance, but he's also respectful toward Putin. But number two, always in the background, is Putin's desire to drive a wedge between Turkey and NATO, or Turkey and the West. I think Putin must know that Kılıçdaroğlu, he certainly reads, his statements, is all about bringing Turkey closer to Europe again, whereas Erdogan pursues a more independent path for Turkish foreign policy. As I was saying before, yes, a bridge between East and West, but more rooted now in the East than in the West, whereas for Kılıçdaroğlu, the bridge between East and West would be more anchored in the West. And so Putin likes the guy who wants a weaker anchoring in the West. That's Erdogan.
Matt, do you feel that there is a favorite in this runoff for Washington and Brussels?
Officially, of course not, right? They'll always say that we're neutral, but without a doubt, they both would prefer, I think, that Kılıçdaroğlu won. However, in the last several months, we've seen President Biden and Secretary Blinken pursue an effort to improve relations with Turkey, and that's evidenced by the F-16 deal. I mean, Erdogan proposed the F-16 deal as a way to take the venom out of the dispute over the F-35. Turkey had paid whatever, $1.5 or so billion into the F-35 program, and then was kicked out when it went ahead with the purchase of Russian S-400 air defense system. So I think at the urgings of a lot of people, President Erdogan decided to de-escalate, and he said, hey, what the heck? Why don't we just apply that money and then a bunch more to buying aircraft, U.S. aircraft, we already have F-16s. How could Washington oppose that? Okay, well, and we'll forget about the F-35. And Biden has made clear he wants the deal to go ahead, and it will, by the way, because Congress won't block it. So Washington has awakened to the need to work with Turkey as a strategic partner. But, at the same time, it was then candidate Biden who famously in November of 2019 said there needs to be a new leadership in Turkey, but via the ballot box. I'm not sure how much that underlying view has changed in Washington. Certainly in Paris, I mean, Macron has been bombastically clear in whom he favors. And I think to the detriment of the NATO alliance, as so many things Macron has said have been to NATO, not the least of which being calling it brain dead. But officially, of course, they have to remain neutral. And I think I have no doubt. I have very little doubt that Erdogan's going to win the runoff. I mean, he's 1/2 of a percentage point away from 50%. Kılıçdaroğlu's 5% away, and so that's a much higher and steeper hill for Kılıçdaroğlu to climb. And I just don't. I don't see how there's enough time left to be able to shift the momentum so dramatically. But you never know. I mean, yesterday there were rumors that massive vote fraud had been uncovered and that 3 seats that had gone to AKP were being given instead to the Kurdish-focused party, the HDP, or 2 of them were, and 1 to CHP. That turned out to be false. And, to me, that was a provocation by somebody. But, Russia and others are ready to do whatever they can to destabilize Turkish politics, just as they tried to do in the U.S. and the U.K. and France unsuccessfully.
Matt, speaking about Western alliances, we're going to watch the meeting of the G7 in Japan this week, and President Biden even traveling there, despite the fact that initially it was said that he would not due to the talks on the debt ceiling. And there is an expectation that there will be a talk of toughening sanctions against Russia in the energy sector. And we've seen the myriad of sanctions really in the past 14 months at this point. And as you very closely work with the energy sector, I wanted to hear your assessment about the possibility, first of all, and the plausibility and the necessity of further sanctions, meaningful sanctions against Russia that seem to be on the table for the G7 leaders.
Yeah, I don't think necessarily there will be new sanctions, other than, well, there's a rumor that, and I hope it's true, of course, that any Russian energy pipeline that Moscow has shut off since it invaded Ukraine will never, ever be used again by the European Union to import energy. That would be an additional one. I mean, it's an EU sanction, but it'll be under the G7. And I think that's great. That's sending a powerful signal to Moscow and to investors that they should not expect in our lifetimes that once this horrible war, this illegal war is over, that it'll be business as usual in terms of EU relations with Russia on energy. But besides that, I think that we won't see new sanctions, but we will see efforts to tighten the sanctions and to make sure they're implemented. I mean, there's still a lot of oil that's getting, Russian oil that's getting out that is being sold above the price cap, especially in the Far East. And so, there are EU member states that have large commercial shipping fleets that are moving the Russian oil around the world, and that needs to stop. But I would also say I think the price caps have worked pretty well. We see that the global oil price has decreased in recent months. That deprives Putin of revenues, but that also helps our own economy to avoid and reduce inflation. And we've seen that the revenues year on year, quarter on quarter from oil and gas to Russia have dropped. They dropped by like 43% from the end of last year to the first quarter this year. So those people who say that the price cap is too high and it isn't having an impact on the Russian economy, they're wrong. The price cap is having an impact. So it just needs, I think it needs to be tightened. The implementation of the price cap needs to be tightened. And I think that's what the G7 is going to agree to do.
Matt, you mentioned Macron earlier, and we watched President Zelensky meeting Macron earlier, and then just going on tour, asking for more military help in Europe on this occasion. And it seems like there is another almost parallel alliance is forming that would be given, that pledged to give more weapons to Ukraine. Britain is giving more far-range weapons. Yeah. How do you feel this is developing, and do you think that the European nations somehow are creating these alternative platforms to be working with Ukraine? And if we're talking about Ukraine fatigue in Europe that has been, in the talks for the last few months, how is it all going to be shaping up, considering the promise of the offensive that maybe started, maybe didn't start? We don't know exactly, but we're seeing some motion on the battlefield.
We are seeing motion. And I think finally a threshold is being crossed across Europe that will allow more capable, longer range, more potent weapons to be delivered from NATO member states to Ukraine. And it's a shame it's taken this long. I mean, if we're going to end up providing those weapons anyway to Ukraine, why didn't we do it a year ago? But I understand human nature. People were frightened. They didn't know what Putin was going to do with his nuclear saber rattling, and didn't know if Ukraine was going to perform on the battlefield and would be able to use these weapons. Well, Ukraine has proved it's amazingly adaptable. They're such fast learners. They ahead of anyone's expectations, are able to use very effectively the Patriot systems that the U.S. provided. The M1 Abrams tanks are finally arriving. The German Leopard tanks are finally arriving. What Ukraine really needs, though, is what you said: longer range missile strike capabilities like ATACMS, and they need F-16s. It's impossible to imagine how a ground offensive could succeed without controlling the skies. It won't happen. You cannot succeed without that. So it sounds like maybe Washington is moving closer toward giving F-16s. I mean, what you hear more now is well, not yet, rather than no, rather than never. And every red line that the alliance has had on the capability of weapons to provide Ukraine has been passed, except the longer range missiles and the F-16 fighter jets and other NATO fighter jets. And then the other thing to talk about is politically how dramatically the attitudes of Germany have shifted with we recall Chancellor Scholz just right after Russia invaded last year saying now Germany's going to allocate another 100 billion euros for military procurement. Excuse me. But that money really hasn't been spent yet. So what I sense is that it's not so much Ukraine fatigue. In the conferences I've attended recently with senior European leaders, their rhetoric is tougher than ever on the need to defeat Russia. But the actions have been slow. And as I said, Germany hasn't spent any of that 100 billion yet. And it's been slow to deliver these more potent weapons. But those deliveries are beginning. And so I definitely feel the momentum has already changed. And if you listen to what Ukraine's leaders say, they were talking about maybe a late winter offensive, but then it was really the spring offensive. And now, no, it's a summer offensive. And that's, I think, because they've listened to the advice of their allies to slow down. There's no rush. Be ready. And they also the Ukrainians feel that, as we're saying, that the tide has turned a bit and they're getting more of the types of weapons they need to succeed. But until they get them and learn how to use them and learn how to integrate them into a combined arms offensive, it would be premature for them to attack.
Matt, on the tide turning, the battle for Bakhmut has been the microcosm, in a sense, of the motion on the battlefield. And in the last few days, there are developments. Both sides are reporting its own gains, but it sounds like there is quite a bit of trouble for Wagner Group and for Prigozhin as well. And Washington Post just reported that Prigozhin allegedly said that he would point Ukrainian forces to where to attack Russian forces if Wagner is not sufficiently supported on the ground in Bakhmut and needs to withdraw. What do you make of this dynamic?
But that was an astounding report in the Washington Post a couple of days ago. And if it's true, that's treason. I mean, that's an offense punishable by death. And no reason not to believe it. I mean, I found the Post article really quite convincing. And so that shows us the utter disarray at the highest level of Russian power, with Prigozhin constantly going after Defense Minister Shoigu and all the military commanders. Why he's doing that, who the heck knows? Is it raw ambition? Is it some deal he expected that wasn't followed through on? Is he just sincerely upset that the Russian military, maybe for their own jealous reasons, and the person of Shoigu is trying to sabotage the Wagner Group? It's hard to tell, but it's unbelievable. That Prigozhin gets away with those sorts of statements, but B, that it's happening at all, that we can see what's going on, and that there is such utter disarray at the most elite levels of Russian military politics. And it also prompts the question of what is going through Putin's mind in terms of maintaining power. I just don't know how he could allow those sorts of statements by Prigozhin, unless Putin, is worried about Shoigu somehow and the Russian military possibly being a threat to Putin. So there's so much that we don't know, but that is suggested by these amazing statements by Prigozhin. The one thing we know is the Russian military has proven itself incapable so far, under terrible leadership, with horrible intelligence, riven with corruption, but we also know that Putin is willing to sacrifice as many Russian men as he needs to, as cannon fodder, to absorb so brutally as much of the weaponry that Ukraine is receiving from the West, in the hope of tiring out Ukraine and the West. And I just see no sign of Ukraine and its friends in the West tiring. And this is a war Putin has lost. And all that can happen now is more and more Russian men will be slaughtered, and Ukrainians as well. But the end is clear what's going to happen. And I think we have to be really careful to guard against being intimidated by Putin's empty nuclear saber rattling. He may have miscalculated horribly. He may have been told what he wanted to hear by his intelligence team, and they were wrong. But he's not crazy. He may have a distorted view of history and a sense of some messianic mission, but his number one concern is Vladimir Putin. And he believes that we're going to break because we're so frightened by his nuclear rhetoric. We haven't. We've called all of his bluffs, and we have to keep doing that.
Matt, do you feel, is there any sign, any talk of Putin being kind of endangered by some elite troubles, internal domestic elite troubles? Can they turn against him?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have access to any classified information, but it certainly does seem like the most powerful people beneath him basically are at each other's throats. And to permit that in the open either means Putin lacks a certain degree of control, or he wants that sort of disputatiousness in the open because he's afraid. He's afraid of one group or the other getting too powerful. I've heard from one national leader of a country near Russia not long ago that, not only has Putin lost the war, but he can't extricate himself. He can't get out. He's trapped. He's stuck. And therefore, the fear that he so relies on to intimidate either leaders of former Soviet socialist republics or previously Europe is no longer there. One of the most powerful lessons I was ever taught was by a deputy speaker of the Russian Duma back in, this was in 1998. And he said to me, you Americans and Europeans, you don't understand. You think that economics or being liked gives you power. No, power comes from one source, being feared. And we want to be the most feared country on earth, Russia. Well, now we see the emperor has new clothes. There's nothing to fear. They've lost. And Putin is not feared anymore. And that also causes huge problems for him in what he calls the near abroad, which a term I hate, but in his neighbors.